the Post Newspaper Podcast, your community news. Welcome back to the podcast. Today's special guest is Eric Berger, Senior Space Editor of Ars Technica, founder of Space City Weather, and author of the books Liftoff and Reentry. Eric, thanks for coming on the podcast. I've been looking forward to doing this interview for some time. You know, I run across you at NASA quite a bit. I see you walking in the neighborhood. I follow you on Space City Weather. There's a lot to flesh out, but let's start with the basics. How did you get into journalism in the first place?
Well, it was funny, Richard. You know, I was always interested in science growing up, and astronomy in particular. I had good teachers for that. So I went down to the University of Texas at Austin to study astronomy. And it was all right, but it was a lot of physics and calculus. And I powered through it, but it wasn't my forte. So I ended up realizing toward the end of my junior year, I like to write about science. I'm not sure I want to do science. So that sort of steered me in toward a course in science journalism.
Okay. Now, where did that take you? When you entered that class, what were some of your first assignments?
Well, I mean, a lot of it really was like the stellar chemistry, understanding the basics of star formation, learning, vector and differential calculus, that kind of stuff.
Okay. And so at what point did you find yourself with your course load going from one subject to going more into journalism?
Right. So as I say, after my junior year, I was like, well, I can do this, but I wouldn't say like I'm near the top of the class. And so I actually had a conversation over that summer with a journalism professor at UT. And he's like, well, you ought to consider journalism. So I ended up going to Missouri for a master's school degree in journalism. Spent a couple of years kind of getting the fundamentals of reporting and writing and so forth.
Okay. Did you do any work for like the school paper or local community papers or something like that?
I did. I wrote for the Columbia Missourian for a couple semesters. I got my hands wet with sort of daily journalism and learning how to meet deadlines, and that was certainly different than writing a college essay.
Okay. And so you leave college, eventually you get your degree, you're out there, you've got a little bit of writing experience. Where did your first journalism job take you? Where was your first paper?
So I'd had a girlfriend in college and at UT, and she ended up in the Woodlands, and so I promised her when I went up to grad school that I would come back and, wherever she was, find a job. So my first job was with a weekly paper called the Woodlands Villager, $8 an hour. But then I started working weekends at the Houston Chronicle. And within about a year and a half, I got hired on there as just a weekend GA. So I worked Tuesday through Saturday from like 4 to midnight.
Okay. How did you find working for an actual paper compared to what you learned in college?
A lot of respects, it was the same because in Columbia, at the University of Missouri, they really kind of focused on print journalism. So the editors that I worked with there had, by and large, worked at daily newspapers. So in some respects, it was quite a bit the same. In other respects, it was different, though, because obviously the stakes in Houston, Texas, at the daily newspaper are a little bit higher than they are at like the college newspaper in Columbia, Missouri.
Okay. And beats, do you remember some of your first beats you started writing?
I do. I was basically the general assignments reporter like on nights and weekends. So it was just whatever oddball stuff came up that you had to cover. And there were some times where I would have to go cover the cop shift, so I'd have to go to the police station and listen to the scanner, and I was terrible at that because I never knew what they were saying, could never figure out that. And really didn't like that at all. You get sent to parades, things like that. And I got my first taste of weather writing back then because, they'd be like, wow, there's a cold front coming tomorrow, we're in a drought, write something up for the paper tomorrow morning. So that was really my first experience with that.
Okay. How long did it take you to figure out that was the direction you wanted to pursue a little bit more than, say, maybe, following the police or city council and sports? Well,
I had kind of got out of grad school with the idea that I wanted to write about science, right? I had an astronomy background with the journalism, and so the goal was to basically, become the science beat reporter at a major daily. And so the goal was to become a science writer, which I did around 2002, 2003. And so for about a decade, my job was mostly writing about science. I did start writing about weather more, particularly an important event was Tropical Storm Allison in 2001. major flood storm. And I kind of took ownership of writing about the aftermath of that and the idea, and started writing more about weather. And sort of the whole genesis of that was I was completely gobsmacked by flooding from that time. I had just bought a house in Houston off of White Oak Bayou, and had never seen rain like that or flooding like that before, coming from Houston, living in Austin. And so it really was eye-opening, and I basically never wanted to be in a position where I was caught off guard again by something like that. So I really started paying attention more to the weather. But it was just kind of a small subset of science in general.
Right. Did you go and go back and, I guess, to build expertise in writing and all the research around that, did you go back and take any classes in that? Because I know we're going to get into Space City Weather here a bit. So was there one thing that you started in journalism that led you to that at this stage in your journalism career?
It was really a series of hurricanes that got me jazzed up and interested in weather. So there were two things that happened in 2005 in particular. That was the year we had Katrina that hit New Orleans, and then Rita that threatened Houston. And I had just started blogging at the time, which is 20 years ago. It was a big thing back then. And the thing about writing about weather online was, when you did something for the newspaper, you were writing it 12 to 16 hours in advance of it being published and people reading it. So by then the forecast is a day or half a day or a little more old. And obviously it's a huge, the TV stations have a huge advantage. But by writing about weather online, blogging, and eventually in other formats, you could write it immediate, and you could use all the online graphics and imagery to really tell the same kind of story they were doing with television. And so I really like that because it opened the possibility to writing about weather in real time. And so I got really interested in weather and blogging kind of in the mid-2000s, and that really opened up a new possibility for me. And so then a few years later, we had Hurricane Ike in 2008. And again, I was writing a lot about that online. It was really popular on the website. And I realized, well, if I'm going to write about weather as much as I am, I really ought not just be a journalist, I ought to become a meteorologist. So the University of, or Mississippi State University has a mostly online course. It's designed for broadcast journalists. Like if you're a TV reporter, you want to move over to the weather department, you take this classes for 2.5 years. But it's open to anyone. And so I enrolled in that and sort of basically became a meteorologist, certified after taking about 60 credit hours. Most of it online, but not all of it. And I completed that in 2014.
Okay. At what point did you go to work for the Chronicle full time? Because I know you had a pretty long stint at the Chronicle.
Well, I started out in 1998 part-time, and then full-time I got hired full-time in end of 98 or early 99. But I was there for 17 years. I was there through 2015.
Okay. And for a lot of people, they think, well, a newspaper is a newspaper. Well, you and I know that's there are some parallels, of course, but there are some differences. What would you say for people out there listening to this or watching this that are not familiar with how these papers and media production systems work? What's the biggest difference between working for someone like the Chronicle as opposed to like a smaller community newspaper?
Well, I think at the Chronicle, it's difficult to really focus in on, a low community, right? In a community newspaper, you can really get down into the issues that people really care about. And so in League City, you care about what's happening at the park over here. You care about the crime statistics. Whereas if you're writing about the Houston Chronicle, you're writing about sort of a metro area of 8 million people. Mm-hmm. So you can't really dig down as deep or more as granular into those kinds of issues.
Mm-hmm. And along the way, so you went from writing on science to general reporting to weather, but then you got into space. You kind of went back and I guess developed the interest in space that you first picked up there in the university.
So I'd always been kind of interested in space as a kid, but the Chronicle had a space reporter. And then after the financial crisis in 2007 and 2008, that was a really big blow to the publishing industry. They laid off some people, and one of the people they laid off was the space reporters. They came to me and said, well, you're going to be covering space now too. And I was interested in it, and it was kind of fun, but it was, it was still, NASA was still flying the space shuttle, and kind of wasn't as exciting, certainly as it is now. But then I got pretty interested in the commercial space revolution that was happening, and I took a year, 2014 actually, and just spent a whole year writing about what NASA's plans were for deep space exploration, the rise of the commercial space industry, and kind of was focusing on how NASA's was sort of directionless in their human space program. I called it the series Adrift. And that was great because I got to travel all over the country. I got to travel to Russia, Kazakhstan, to really understand the space program. And that gave me a really deep appreciation for NASA and for the whole industry and how it was really undergoing a pretty rapid change. And so I became pretty passionate at that point. As a science journalist, you'd written a lot about genetics and nanotechnology and physics and biology and all that stuff. But I sort of realized about 10 years ago that I was really interested in space and weather.
So in the time I've been out covering NASA, which I guess is going on about 4 years now, I've seen you out there quite a bit, you and Mark, and some of the more regular folks out there that are covering NASA. What was your experience like when you first went out there? Your first press conference or first event?
My first event was 2003. It was the Space Shuttle Columbia tragedy.
Oh.
So very first time I stepped foot on Johnson Space Center proper was in the immediate aftermath of the loss of the space shuttle with 7 astronauts. And so that was obviously a pretty somber event. And that investigation unfolded over weeks and months as NASA sought to understand why the cause of the accident, the foam hitting the wing of the shuttle and all of the aftermath. And so that was really my introductory experience, which wasn't great.
Okay. And so these years later, you've covered a lot of stuff out there. What do you find the most interesting aspect of how things work at JSC? I know there's various NASA agencies within NASA, but JSC in particular, I mean, it's in our backyard. What do you like the most about going out there and covering the news?
I mean, I like the people because, it's a lot of engineers, a lot of scientists, and they're all there by and large because they care about what they're doing, right? They're there because they enjoy space exploration. They want to see NASA succeed. And I mean, any reasonable person, myself included, wants to see NASA be wildly successful. So I just appreciate the fact that, that in our backyard we have, more than 10,000 people that are working every day to advance space exploration.
How often would you find yourself writing pieces these days about space?
Almost every day. I mean, I have my day job. I left the Chronicle in 2015 to write for a website called Ars Technica. Didn't have much of a space beat, but since then I've been able to really grow it. We've hired a second space reporter. It's the most popular part of the website, and just I get to write about different aspects of space every day.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about the transition from the Chronicle to Ars Technica.
Yeah,
explain that a little bit. How'd you go from one to the other?
Well, I'd worked at the Chronicle for a long time. It started to get pretty successful in both my sort of online platform, at writing about weather and writing about space, and the paper just wasn't really in a position to sort of financially reward me for that. Like if it'd been 10 years earlier, I would have written a column and, gotten paid quite a bit of money. But the industry had changed quite a bit. And I also didn't like their strategy to put a lot of stuff behind a paywall. A lot of my audience for space stuff was not in Houston. It was in Florida or Washington, D.C. or California. And just so I felt like their online strategy wasn't great. And Ars Technica, joined by Condé Nast, was a purely online publication, no paywall, smart writers, and basically the job was come on in and write whatever you want about space, however you want. And that was extremely freeing because at the Chronicle, I always felt like the editors kind of held me back a little bit because there were lots of things wrong with NASA policy, things that the Space Agency was doing that did not make sense, and I felt like I ought to be called out. And so moving to Ars Technica sort of allowed me to be more activist is very much the wrong word, but to sort of call things out when I felt like they were needed to be called out, like bad decisions that Congress was forcing on the agency, or that some people within the agency had decided to make it maybe for parochial interest rather than for national interest, things like that.
Okay. Now, how did you find out about the website, and how did you actually go, get that interview, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Did you know the person that run it? Did you meet them?
One of the editors at the publication is a guy named Lee Hutchison. He lives in League City on the other side of the freeway. So are they really part of League City on that side of I-45? I don't know. Anyway, he lives over there, and was familiar with my work at the Chronicle and the Adrift series I did, and they were looking to hire a space beat, and we had met a couple times. So he just called me up and asked me if I was interested, and my first reaction was no. I mean, I had other opportunities, but I'd worked at the Chronicle so long, I was comfortable there. I wasn't sure about Ars Technica, but then the more I considered it, talked to my wife Amanda about it, it just seemed like it was the right time to sort of take a leap of faith. Okay.
And how long have you been there now?
Well, it's been almost 10 years. It'll be 10 years this October, and it's been fabulous.
Okay. Has that taken you around the world, like some of the coverage you did for the Chronicle?
Yes, I've been to Japan, South America, Europe, of course. Yeah, I've been lots of places.
Mm-hmm. Writing for a website like that, you don't have the print deadlines like you talked about earlier. How is that style of journalism? When you look back at the years that you've been where it was heavily print, that went into blogs, and now websites, et cetera, et cetera. Now we're in the podcasting world. What's the differences with a completely online site as opposed to a more traditional site that's got other hybrid outlets?
Well, of course, every different online publication has its own style and its own editorial slant. The goal with Ars Technica is to really hire people who know their subject matter and then turn them loose. So go write authoritatively about Google, go write authoritatively about biology, go write authoritatively about AI policy. And so I was just told to go write authoritatively about spaceflight. And I've sort of stretched that beat to really, as I say, as we talked about, become both authoritative in what I write, but also have some viewpoint in there saying what's being done here is really dumb, or this private company is trying this idea and it's very unlikely to succeed, or these people are taking a huge risk but the payoff is huge, and we really ought to pat them on the back and say thanks for seeing if this works. It's just sort of it's been much more freeing, I guess.
Okay.
Liberating.
And so the space industry today, you talked a lot about sort of the commercial side of it as well, not just the government side, but what excites you about what you see?
Everything. Oh my gosh. The space industry has gotten so much better in the last 15 years.
Okay.
Nothing against NASA, but back in 2010, it was pretty much all NASA and the space shuttle and some science missions, and that was it. And man, there's just a multiplicity of actors now. And so the two big changes since 20 years ago is number one, the rise of China. So now there's this great flourishing space industry there that's rising up to rival NASA. And then in the background you also have India rising, Europe doing more, Japan doing more, and other countries sort of taking interesting new directions. And then you have the private companies, which have SpaceX was the first one to really be hugely successful, but their success has allowed venture capital to flow into whole different, new ideas. And so I just remember coming to Ars Technica in 2015 wondering, man, is there going to be enough news to write a story every day, or 4 stories a week? And a few years ago, we had to hire someone else because there was just way too much cool stuff to cover. And even with 2 of us now, there's way more news happening than we can possibly write about every day.
Journalistic techniques. People say, well, how in the world do you come up with these story ideas? You and I know how we do that, but explain that to someone who doesn't know how we do what we do, or how you do what you do.
I mean, it's all kinds of different things, right? It's old news releases, someone will say, hey, this is happening. or you'll write off of like a government report that comes out, or NASA will hold a press conference, or a company will hold a press conference, or they'll have quarterly earnings calls for the publicly traded companies, or you'll get a tip by phone call or text or signal or something like that, or you'll see something on social media and realize that something really interesting is happening. So it's just, a multiplicity of ways you get news that, or I'll see something, someone will report something, and I'll be like, well, you'll follow up on that story. So it's just, all kinds of things.
Okay. How important are sources for you? Do you depend heavily on sources, or you just have a few that you use here and there?
No, I mean, you're nothing without good sources. I get more than half of my ideas from sources, and oftentimes that's the only way to get news that really is important. NASA is pretty buttoned down, and they try to keep things under wraps. Mm-hmm. Like, for example, about 6 weeks ago, a source said that the Trump administration was planning to cut NASA's science budget by 50%. Maybe it was 2 months ago, I don't know. But I reported that, and a few people picked it up, but, it was not widely reported because no one else had really sourced that. And then, of course, the skinny budget comes out, and it's exactly that 50% cut.
When you're out at a press conference, everyone's got their style of asking questions. You know how this is. You've done it a lot longer than I have. They pass the microphone around if you have a question inside or the phone bridge, et cetera. How do you build your question list? Do you build a list ahead of time, or you just think extemporaneously? As kind of as people are given the updates, whether it's an astronaut or an engineer, they'll update us first. I know I get a few ideas based on what they say, but what's your approach?
Usually before a press conference, as I'm driving over, I'll think about what's really important here. What do I really want to know? And then, if they address that during the briefing, great. I'll ask something else, and if they don't, then I'll, try to, get them to speak about that. But really, on the record, it's relatively rare to get NASA officials or people. So sometimes I'll even, sometimes you'll ask a question that's not even directly related to the event about something else that I'm working on to sort of get them to comment publicly about something that otherwise might be difficult to do.
Right. Relationships at NASA, I know with me, without the PAOs and news chiefs and stuff like that, you're not going to get much. You've got to have that relationship with them. Talk about what it was like for you to build those relationships, especially going back whenever you went out there for the first time.
I think the important thing is to just show up, right? Mm-hmm. If you show up and write about NASA intelligently and show an interest, that goes a long way to knowing that you're not fly by night, and if they're going to put a little more time to build a relationship with you because you're going to be there 5 years or 10 years from now.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, somewhere along the way, you went back and you developed, like you talked earlier about getting the degree, the certifications in meteorology. You developed Space City Weather. How did that come about? So
I had developed a weather site within the Chronicle that I had written about for daily, with daily forecasts and things like that. So that was a big part of what I was doing there. And actually, when I left, I made the decision to leave the Chronicle to go to Ars Technica. I went to the editor and I said, I'll keep writing about the weather stuff if you want to, I think I asked for $25,000 a year. And they didn't have the money or whatever, didn't want to do it. I was like, okay, that's fine. I had developed a pretty good audience there in the city. It wasn't huge, but there were people who liked what I did, and especially during extreme weather. So I just decided to create Space City Weather. And it was okay. It was moving along. A really busy day was like 40 or 50,000 page views. But then Hurricane Harvey came along, and it just really exploded. Because that was an event where everyone in the area was focused on weather, and it was such a psychologically difficult event to process because it was this heavy rain day after day after day. For a while it didn't seem to let up, and so people, I think, were looking for someone out there who could empathize with them but also would tell them about the weather. And so the site really just exploded after that.
Talk about some of the experiences, Eric, you've had with after you've written a story, maybe the impact that story had on another person, be it space or technology or weather, etc.?
You know, honestly, it's gratifying because I did a speaking engagement earlier today in Houston where I went and talked for like 25 minutes about Space City weather and upcoming hurricane season, and I'm just blown away by the people who come up afterward and just tell me, like, you know, maybe this man's wife is always telling him what the weather's going to be because she reads the site every day, or how just during this past storm, you know, they were just so grateful to have that source. And so, you know, I kind of lose sight of the fact sometimes, like how important it is what I do, right? Because it's just what I do every morning. I get up, you know, look at the weather and try to figure out what's going to happen. And but it really does like make a meaningful impact on people's lives, and that feels great.
Anytime you start a new business, I mean, it's a risky endeavor, right?
Yeah.
Is it going to work? Is it not going to work? Are people going to like it? Or are they not going to like it? What was it like for you? What were some of those early obstacles that you faced, maybe year one, when most businesses fail, you know?
So I'm not a businessman, and I don't like business, don't like doing business.
Okay.
I like to write. You know, I like to interview people. I like journalism. But, you know, let's face it, starting a website is not an expensive hurdle. I mean, basically the only cost early on was my time, and when Matt Lanzik came along, it was his time, right? So we were starting a website, we were using Bluehost, it was like $20 a month. But then, you know, of course, the site overwhelmed them with traffic, and for a while there we were having really difficult issues with servers and things like that. So it wasn't like a huge financial risk. I mean, if it failed, it failed. Okay, you know, we put a few $1,000s into the website, but it's not like we'd made huge capital investments. I mean, I was working out of my, you know, my home office.
At some point in time, you go from you're putting money in, you're putting time and effort in there to this has to make money.
Yeah.
How did you first start making, not to give away all your tips and techniques, but how did you start making money and turning a profit and saying, okay, I'm going to keep doing this. I see something here.
Yeah, so back in 2017, I just started to ask anyone if they wanted to sponsor the site for a month for $1,000. I got, and people, everyone from someone who self-published a book to a local insurance company, you know, had all sort of signed up. And then in June or July of that year, Reliant came to me. And I had always thought, you know, man, it would be great just to have like a single corporate sponsor who would pay a certain amount of money, and, you know, we'd do some things with them, but then I wouldn't have to worry about all the changing things up every month and all that. And they came in and said, we want to sponsor the site for the rest of the year. So just $1,000 a month or $1,500, I don't know more or less. And they were great, and so we did it, and then like 2 months later, Harvey happened. And the site, you know, in terms of traffic, really exploded in visibility and so forth. And so they came back and said, well, that was great, and they wanted to sponsor fall of 2018 for more money, and so they had just been our annual sponsor every year, and so they get some visibility on the website and in each post, but it's pretty low key. We don't have pop-up ads or videos or any of that stuff, and that's it. And then every year now we have a fundraiser where we ask people for donations or to buy a T-shirt or things like that. So we raised money from both of those, and it's more than enough to compensate Matt and myself for our time. The website, honestly, the biggest expense we've had is developing an app, because everyone wants an app. And so we've done that for about 5 years now, and you know, we had like 150,000 people now in the Houston area have the app. It's all free, right? So it's not, we don't charge anything, but again, sort of our readers help pay for that with the annual fundraiser.
And I know you've published at least a couple of books. How many books have you published so far?
So I've written 2 books about space. I think the greatest space story in my professional lifetime has been the rise of SpaceX. They've completely transformed the industry. I mean, you know, they're the only company outside of China and Russia that can put humans in orbit. They have 10 times more satellites than any other company or country in the world. They launched 150, or launched 150 rockets this year. They fly the world's heaviest rocket. It's just a phenomenal story, good and bad. And I feel privileged because I've gotten to really write the first books that talk to all of the people that were involved in the early years of SpaceX. So my first book was called Liftoff. It's about the origins of SpaceX, all of the struggles they had with the Falcon 1 rocket and all the failures they had with it, before they ultimately had some success in 2008. And then I wrote a second book about the Falcon 9 and Dragon era that kind of brings us up to 2020, just sort of chronicling the rise of the company from kind of David to Goliath.
Okay. And talk about, if you will, Eric, the difference between writing newspaper articles and then website articles to publishing a book.
Right. So
is writing just writing?
No, I mean, writing is writing.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, I do it quickly. But, there's a difference, right? So the standard story on Ars Technica is 600, 800, 1,000 words. A feature story will be 2,000 or 3,000. A book chapter is like 8,000 words, and so a book is about 100,000 words. So there's a huge difference.
Right.
And so Liftoff was a great learning experience about how kind of crafting a narrative and finding a style and make sure you tell a story that readers are really engaged with.
How did you find tweaking your style from journalism to writing a book?
Yeah, so I just kind of viewed it as 10 or 12 very long feature articles. Each chapter was kind of like a self-contained story. But it really was about, the most important thing was getting the great stories. So it was talking to the people who were there, from Elon on down, the people who did the stuff, who had the success, who had the setbacks and the failures, and getting their stories and figuring out a way to sort of combine them into kind of a compelling narrative that hopefully reads kind of like a thriller, but actually really happened.
Okay. Do you have any more books in the pipeline?
I do, but I can't really talk about them yet.
Okay. I understand. You talked earlier about AI, just a little bit. We talked about some of that as far as Ars Technica's coverage. Do you fear AI as a journalist, or do you embrace it and just say, it's inevitable, I'm going to use it as a tool, and that's it?
I don't fear it too much. Although I think we all should have a healthy fear of what AI could do to society. I mean, look at the weather business, right? There's a million weather apps on your phone. There's 4 or 5 TV stations in the Houston area that have weather departments. Right. There's a million from weather.com on down, a million places you can get a 10-day forecast. So what makes Space City Weather special? I mean, I think it's the fact that it's 2 human beings that are very real, have their faults, but are just out there every day sort of trying to look at every piece of data available and make the best possible forecast. And I got to tell you, Richard, when severe storms threaten, people turn to sources that they can trust. And so, what we've tried to build over the last 10 years at Space City Weather is a brand and a place that people can come to know that they can trust that information, right? To have no doubts that these people are only trying to make the best possible forecast. They're not chasing ratings. They're not chasing clicks. They're just sort of trying to put the best possible information out there. And I think in a world that already is and in the future will be even more awash in AI-generated content, a lot of which is going to be crap, some of which will be very good, I think people will be looking for that human connection. And so while there will be lots of losses, I feel like Space City Weather is positioned for success because we're kind of really going against the grain.
The future of Space City Weather. We've been talking about it a fair amount the last few minutes, and what you started with, what you have now. Are there any features and additions coming up you want to talk about?
We think a lot about that, and the goal really is to meet our readers where they are, right? So is the future of Space City Weather more as an app and a newsletter rather than a website? I don't know. Like, we're sort of trying to figure out, our social media strategy, and just making sure that wherever readers are finding their content. So one of the things obviously we struggled with is that a lot of younger people get their news on TikTok. And I'm 52 now. Matt's about 40, and so we're not exactly the TikTok generation. So how do we reach those people? And so we're trying to figure out those things and make sure that Space City Weather remains relevant.
Okay. Going back to space for a second, we talked about a lot of stuff that you've covered in the past. What are you looking forward to most in the space industry? Not just necessarily NASA, but the whole space industry in the next 5 years.
So I'm really excited about Jared Isaacman being the administrator of NASA. I know Jared pretty well. He's a very genuine guy, really legitimately wants to advance spaceflight. We've never had a credible program to send humans to Mars ever in this world. I don't know if NASA is going to get there in the next 5 years, not to Mars, but sort of is laying the groundwork for a program that will ultimately do that. But that door is at least open. And so I'm going to be excited to see how he and other people work to carry out that vision and whether they're successful.
Okay. And I guess to tie the interview off, Eric, I always like to do this with all my interviews, especially when I'm interviewing someone with the experience that you have. What's your advice for the up-and-coming journalism student or anyone that has any interest in storytelling, whether they're a student or they're just someone on the outside that just has that interest in what's going on around them?
So first of all, the journalism industry has changed so much in my career. When I started in the 1990s, newspapers were still kind of king. And now, obviously, the whole media landscape has been transformed. But I think a couple key things, a couple important things remain constant today. It's great to ask ChatGPT or Grok or whatever to write something for you, but you really ought to be able to know how to write. And I think increasingly in news coverage, specialization is super important. So you should find a subject that you're knowledgeable about, but even more than that, passionate about. Because your writing and coverage, I think, is so much better if you're writing or making videos about or whatever medium you choose, if it's something you're interested in. You'll just work harder and the work will feel less like work. So I would encourage people to learn how to write, to learn how to tell stories, and to work in an area that they're really interested and passionate about.
And lastly, going into the business side of things, just for a second, you had great advice for up-and-coming journalists, but someone who has an idea, a passion and interest, maybe it works, maybe it doesn't, advice to them as far as taking that chance and doing your best to see it through.
So in your lifetime, there 3 or 4 opportunities will come along that will change your life for the better, whether your career, personal life, whatever. And the challenge of life is recognizing those opportunities and seizing them.
Okay. And if people want to find out more about your NASA coverage, Space City Weather, books, what's the best place for them to find that info, Eric?
The Space City Weather is pretty straightforward.
Right.
You can find us website, app, social media. We're kind of everywhere. Ars Technica is the website for news, and you can find more information about my books there, or people can Google me.
Okay. And if they want to have you come out, you talked earlier about going out and doing some talks. If people want to have you come out, same thing as your contact information on the website.
Yeah.
Very good. Well, appreciate you coming on, Eric.
Thanks, Richard.
If you enjoyed this video, consider supporting our effort to share the news in print and on our extensive website, and now on our new YouTube channel. Contact publisher David Day at area code 409-943-4265 to support the Post newspaper today.